The title of our panel today is Social Media a Threat to Democracy? Well, although I'd argue that it started long before the 2016 election, the past 2 years has given us a new lens on the fragility of our own democracy. The upside of this realization is that we're starting to discuss our democracy as we should any critical infrastructure, like a top priority in national security. To take the security analogy a bit further, in the age of globalization, digital has increased the surface area of our vulnerability. There have been two simultaneous developments in these past decades. I was a national security staff person on the Hill, so I'll probably refer to that analogy quite a bit. We've hardened our defenses ostensibly to protect against the threats of globalization. The American military is engaged in combat in 7 countries right now, fighting violent extremism. Violent extremist groups, meanwhile, have adopted entrepreneurial habits, they pitch ideology, and they crowdfund it with grievance. We've redesigned cities to cope with this threat. All the guns and barriers around Washington, D.C. attest to that. As a nation, we've hunkered down. But at the same time, we've broadened the battlefield surface. We've created a world where we're all connected all the time, and this area is vulnerable. And this vulnerability is not just technical, like device security. It's the foundation of our democracy's very resilience. It's about social cohesion. And in plain language, social cohesion is just the willingness of members of a society to cooperate and endure challenges together. Protecting democracy in the digital age is a policy problem, not a market problem. It is a whole-of-nation challenge. If we leave it to Silicon Valley, we could end up with optimal laundry and fewer voting rights. But if we leave it up to Washington, we may get top-down directives based on an understanding of tech from the 1980s. We'll learn about that from pagers and bells. If it's coming from the Senate, we'll learn about it from messenger pigeons and flares. In tech, the market does not reward making things secure or society more coherent. It rewards cheap, fast, and sparkly. The history of our democracy informs us that the costs must be internalized before the market can balance its profit imperative with social goods. So the questions and the themes today: what would that cost-benefit signal look like for industry? Is there a balance between reform and regulation? Can human agency and creativity even compete with computational propaganda and malevolent AI? How can we see this not as innovation at risk, but as a chance to spur a different kind of innovation? And to incentivize security looks easy compared to getting Americans to like each other well enough to keep this whole experiment in democracy going forward. And so I would like to thank the sponsors and conveners today, because building a bridge between DC and California, what I like to say, between the tech revolution and governing institutions, is a really important first step. So I'm going to start the questions with Renee. Based on your research, could you describe the landscape for the challenges we're facing in coping productively with computational propaganda and information weaponization?
Sure. So I would say the main challenge that we have right now is that the social media ecosystem, as it has evolved, which it evolved in the way that it did a period of sort of the early days of blogs where anyone could write what they wanted to, and there was not very much in the way of cohesive distribution. So there was always misinformation on the internet. But what has changed as social media has evolved is the mass consolidation of audiences onto a very small handful of platforms. Tools, business models that the platforms use, which are designed primarily to drive engagement, which means that they amplify the content that's most likely to be interesting to people. Oftentimes, as we're learning from research, that's the most sort of sensational or rage-inducing content. So the virality engines and facilitate the spread of information from person to person. The speed at which this happens, the velocity, is much faster than we had seen previously. So we have this system of precision targeting enabled by the way the platforms understand their user base to serve ads to them, mass consolidation of audiences, and the fact is that a lot of the misinformation campaigns out there look very much like what we have come to consider standard collectivism, standard kind of activism online. And so there's a challenge to uncovering these operations, and then a challenge to sort of solving them because they are using the platforms as they were intended to be used.
The slides are up too, and I think there might be one more. So we'll keep those up so people can note down the elements of Renee's
That was
research.
sort of the who was doing it, how they were doing it, and where they were doing it. This was the who. So, sorry, I didn't realize that there was even going.
Yeah. And my next question is for Berin. Last summer, I attended TechFreedom's Back to the Future conference in downtown Washington. The theme was how the policy crowd in the room could promote an agile mindset for tech policymaking. You asked us to address real threats and the harms of digital without stifling innovation. Could you, as a legal expert, what lawmaking tools already exist to make progress on this challenge? You note that we must craft a risk management strategy that avoids stifling top-down directives typical of government. But right now, the bottom-up scene looks like a mob scene, certainly for elected leaders where I worked. Is there a middle-out strategy here? And could you share with us a policy step forward that allows for experimentation, innovation, and evolution, which is TechFreedom's mission?
Yeah, thanks. So first, let me say, I think the threat to democracy is not social media, it's human nature. I mean, human beings are really not wired to be, generally speaking, I mean, by default, to be able to engage in thoughtful, constructive civic discourse, right? That's the problem we're seeing, and this is simply a way of revealing that, but it's not a new problem. If you haven't read, just for example, Anne Applebaum's piece in The Atlantic recently about the polarization of European politics, especially in Poland, it's a really telling story. It's very sad, and it really focuses on how small incidents like the Dreyfus affair in France that could divide an entire country and polarize politics because people don't think clearly. People are tribalistic, and they tend to those defaults. So I am not blind to those realities, and I don't think it's helpful to deny that there's a huge problem here. Where I part ways with policymakers who've been leading this conversation is that they go from that to the easy default in every single tech policy conversation is, let's just make the platforms responsible. They'll figure it out. We'll just hold them legally liable for fixing the problem. I think that's problematic in lots of ways. It's probably unconstitutional. We'll talk a little about the First Amendment later. I think that's a good roadmap for thinking about how to think about this. But they're not starting with the actual problem. They're not starting with how you deal with bad actors. So we just spent the last year having a very painful discussion about how to amend Section 230, the law that has made it possible for internet platforms to exist and to host user-generated content without being held liable or having to screen every piece of information. And instead of focusing on the actual problem, which was the sex traffickers themselves and how to enforce the criminal laws against them, instead of doing that, which there was a House bill that I think did a pretty good job of that, we passed that House bill plus a Senate bill that simply said, well, platforms are going to be responsible for figuring it out. And that's the same thing that's happening here. Every policymaker thus far who's jumped into this conversation has said, well, we just need to make sure that the platforms will decide who can and can't speak, right? That's a terrible way to begin these conversations, and it ignores the tools that are already out there for dealing with the actual bad actors. So if the problem is, and I think it is a real problem, is foreign attempts at propagandizing Americans, we already have some legal tools on the books. They're just extremely out of date and essentially useless. So people are finally starting to hear about the Foreign Agent Registration Act because, of course, it appears that many of Trump's closest associates may have violated FARA by not registering as foreign actors. Most notably, Paul Manafort is going to have a second trial as to whether he's violated FARA. To my knowledge, that will be the first criminal prosecution of FARA in something like 3 decades. There hasn't been a civil action in FARA in something like 4 decades. I may have had those two reversed. But there are reasons why that law is essentially unenforceable. There are several bills in Congress pending to fix FARA, to ensure that, for example, the Department of Justice actually has subpoena power to investigate foreign actors who fail to register, to go after them. No one has heard anything about those because those don't get any attention. And the members of Congress who have proposed solutions here that all revolve around deputizing the platforms, by and large, have not bothered even to co-sponsor any of those bills. So this is just to say that there are existing legal tools that we could work on to try to deal with this problem. And if we think that the platforms need to do more, we could have a conversation about the platforms that might begin, for example, with if they notice a pattern of suspicious activity, perhaps they should have a legal responsibility to inform the national security agencies and law enforcement, right? That would be a reasonable place to start, if you will, from the bottom up, right? You start with existing laws, you figure out how to enforce them against bad actors, and to the extent that the platforms are in a unique position to know, maybe we do want them to tell us what they, or the law enforcement agencies, what they think is happening, so that we could go through a constitutionally valid process that complies with the First Amendment, where if law enforcement wants to have a particular account taken down because they think it's a foreign actor, they could get a court order to do that, right? Unfortunately, that's not the conversation we're having. We're going straight to deputize the platforms, make them legally responsible for deciding who can and cannot speak. They'll figure it out. So that's sort of where people are coming from generally speaking, the left. Unfortunately, people from the right, Republicans, and the panel this afternoon will talk about this, seem to be coming from exactly the opposite direction and saying, no, we don't want the platforms to make any decisions here. We don't want them to deal with objectionable speech, even though they've been saying for decades they want them to protect children on the internet. Now you have Republicans who seem to be recognizing that they're benefiting from some of these patterns of activity online, and they're essentially saying that we should try to limit the platform's discretion to remove objectionable content by amending that law, Section 230, that I referred to make sure that platforms are politically neutral or to otherwise second-guess them. And I would just say that the foundation here of a responsible approach to this problem is making sure that we don't second-guess the platforms, that we give them the discretion to deal with problems, and that if there are going to be legal requirements for them to do something, that they're extremely narrowly crafted, and that we focus, generally speaking, on the bad actors themselves.
Thank you. And to Mike, in the past decade, you've said the best answer for bad speech is more speech. In a wonderfully relevant recent series on Tech Dirt, which I tweeted early this morning, you note that we need to remember radically democratic empowerment. All of that cheap speech may be part of the problem, but it's also got to be part of the solution. So how does this argument hold up given the bad actor AI and the malevolent capacity of computational propaganda, which contributes to this ongoing poisoning of public discourse? Can human agency counter our democracy's self-harming with things like the Citizens United ruling in 2010, where the Supreme Court allowed an unlimited anonymous money into the public arena? You often call for a broad and deep discussion to lay out the landscape of this challenge and how to move forward. So, if you were the committee staffer in charge of a season of hearings on this challenge of policy on Capitol Hill, what would that season of hearings look like? For example, who would be your witnesses? What would be the first question? And where would you like this jurisdiction to happen?
All right. So let me just think through, tell you a little bit about how I think about this. I was a technologist before I was a lawyer, and before I was a technologist, I was a big history buff. And so who I'd call for committee hearings would be historians of things like mass media. For example, we know that whenever you have a revolution in media and mass media, it's socially disruptive. We actually know this. History has taught this to us for centuries. So, for example, you invent the printing press, and all the people who are really positive about the printing press platform believe that it will spread education, it will spread the word of God as more Bibles are printed. There are a lot of very positive things that people predict. And then at the same time, existing institutions see that spreading around printed materials is disruptive. It sometimes leads to tracts being spread. People spread revolutionary ideas through print. And so every prediction about mass media typically oscillates between the super positive projection of the impact and then a kind of an unhappy panic about the disruptive effect. And we've seen this again and again. So not just the printing press, we've certainly seen it through television. I mean, I'm old enough to remember a time when it was thought that television was eating our brains, and now television is the new novel. Everybody there's television criticism. People teach television in college. And by the way, the novel was, of course, the new novel at one point. Novels were thought to be corrosive. They were thought to be bad for moral character. A whole bunch of things happened with the printing press over the course of centuries. Now, so every time you have a new mass, and the telephone, I could go on, but every time you have a new mass medium, radio, broadcasting, TV, anything, you have, first, people are really upbeat about it, and then there's kind of a backlash of anxiety about it. And I think Berin's right, certainly to point to the First Amendment as a kind of a roadmap for thinking about, but remember that the First Amendment has a set of instrumental functions for democracy. I mean, the First Amendment is supposed to serve democracy and our well-being as a democratic society. So as I said, the biggest threat for democracy is democracy. I mean, democracies often make really bad decisions. And so the question is, when we're thinking about regulating social media, or we're thinking about how we respond to a brand new social media, how do we ensure that democracies make good decisions? So in planning the hearings, I would have, certainly I would have historians come, I certainly would have technologists be witness. And I point out that when we worked on the challenge to the Communications Decency Act that ultimately ruled almost all of it unconstitutional in the Supreme Court in the mid-90s, we had everybody coming in and talking about the value of freedom of expression on the internet and why the internet perhaps deserved even more First Amendment protection even than traditional media. We had and I think that's still true. I think that the question that you raise about the changes in the modern era towards not exactly monopoly platforms, but something close, where what happened to MySpace, what happened to other social media. We now have, Facebook is a dominant player, Twitter is in some respects a dominant player, and so does that change the equation? And I think that there certainly are issues to be raised there. As Tim Wu, I think, wrote in his book, The Master Switch, which actually talks about a series of policy developments that function, as a function of mass media, leading to the internet and including the internet. You often see a lot of competition at one phase of the introduction of a new technology, and then you see shakeouts, which are to some extent driven, not always, but to some extent driven by regulation. Sometimes it's a bad regulation, sometimes it's good regulation, but once you put regulations in place, it often pushes competition out of the way, and you lead, ironically, to monopoly platforms that create new problems. So that's not what's happened with Facebook or with Twitter. Those platforms became dominant, because they were allowed to be really competitive. I'm not going to raise any antitrust issues here because I don't pretend to think that there's an antitrust case here. But I do note that we're still in the very early years of adapting to a mass medium. Berin's point, I think, about the fact that people act foolishly, democracies have to have a high tolerance for that. If you just woke up, democracy, let me just tell you, people are going to want some crazy things and say some crazy things. That's always going to be true. But you have to figure out how you can set the gauge of tolerance pretty high. One of the, and I'll just close on, or at least stop for briefly on this. We worry about fake news. We worry about deep fakes. We worry about being fooled by digital media. My feeling is that ultimately that could be salutary because we always should have been skeptical about any media we ever saw. Mm-hmm. We always should have been, ask ourselves about the provenance of photographs or the provenance of news reporting that we read. And skepticism overall is a good thing, and we still haven't yet trained ourselves up generationally to figure out that we should be so skeptical.
Thank you. Interesting. Just listening to it makes me think of the foreign policy and international development economics, where other countries have experienced this so much already, and so this gives us a chance to see the United States in the scheme of things rather than as the scheme of things as democracies go. So one theme of this conference is how do we begin this discussion to right this imbalance that exists today. There's a lot of policy frameworks and white papers out there. I'll name some from academia, Omidyar's new tech ethics framework at Santa Clara University, the ethical AI list that came out of Brookings this week, and at Georgetown we just did a big project on ethical blockchain, Senator Warner's regulatory framework, Tim O'Reilly's talking about remaking financial markets so they look more like public benefit corporations, so a systems change. Renee, you've been working intensely with policymakers. Do you have any favored policy prescriptions at this point? What are the bright spots we should be keeping our eye on? And also, please go deeper into your research while you answer, because it's so wonderful.
So I would say there's a couple things. First of all, I work on actually detecting misinformation campaigns. So I have this policy hat, and that's who I'm here as today. But my direct work, the work that I do all day long, is actually looking at signatures of artificial speech, right? So this is why when I hear things like "we just need more speech," I think, well, for $5,000, I can buy a whole lot of speech. And I can make sure that you're not going to know where that speech came from. I'm going to make sure it's going to look organic. The biggest cell phone I've ever seen was Twitter's recent decision to allow this ad technology that it gives to campaigns, where you click a button and then, so I as a campaign put out an ad. Recent example last week, I hashtag stand with Ted Cruz, some anthem thing. Twitter creates this ad. The Ted Cruz campaign tweets this ad of this card that this format that Twitter has developed, and real Ted Cruz supporters they click the button and it pops up a field in which the tweet is pre-filled, and then they effectively tweet a virtually identical statement to what the campaign has just tweeted. Now, you can imagine hundreds and then thousands of people doing this. You have literally made your users look like a botnet. So this is a product that Twitter has, for some inexplicable reason, decided is in some way furthering democracy, when what it does is, for people like me, it sets off this little alert on our systems that say that 2,000 people all just tweeted the same thing, which is a really great indication of bot activity. And then ironically, at 2 o'clock in the morning Texas time, a couple hundred to 1,000 people did all of a sudden tweet the same thing. So did all of those people wake up simultaneously at 2 in the morning Texas time to hit their button? Or does this this tool create an opportunity for bad actors to just all go and blast out the identical message, which gives the message lift and hopefully gets it trending? So this is the sort of thing that I look at. So when I hear more speech, I just think, well, it is very, very easy to buy speech.
So can I ask you, so what?
Yep.
What exactly are you saying about that Twitter tool? I mean, I understand that it makes it hard to distinguish botnets from not botnets, but so what? Should Twitter not have done that? How should they have designed their tool? And do you think there's a regulatory response there?
Well, what I'm trying to get at is the difficulty, and no, I'm not arguing for regulation at all here. What I am saying, though, is that there's a short term and a long term. So I've heard your points. In the short term, the platforms are the best lever for creating some sort of meaningful interference or shift in reducing the amount of computational propaganda. Regulation's not going to get there fast enough. Self-regulation's not going to get there fast enough. Individual actions by the platforms, who have a First Amendment right to do it, can actually inject some more of a restoration to speech being the type of activity that we've previously thought of it as. So not mass algorithmic, artificially amplified speech. You might feel that that we are somehow served in the political discourse by having a system in which vast networks of bots can spam a hashtag and push a message. I think that that's artificial. I think that it doesn't really add value to the conversation. I think that it's very easily manipulatable by the sort of litany of actors who want to push it. I don't think that that's a political dialogue.
Well, let me hold on. So I don't disagree with you. I'm just trying to tease out, what exactly do you think Twitter should do differently? How should they, if they don't offer that tool, what should they do?
Well, they have a retweet button. I mean, if you want to retweet it, you can click the retweet button. This is an opportunity for someone to literally push out the same spam message, the same message, in a rather spammy way. So this is an interesting design decision, and I do think that we have to be thinking about one of the things we can do as technologists is think about the design of our systems and how design choices lead to conversational structures, which then lead to conversational frameworks and norms, which then lead to particular types of outcomes. I'm saying that. Do you want to not get into
no, I just want, because we're going to have a chance to go back and forth, and I would also ask people to tweet questions at us with the hashtag, and during the course of the day, again, we'll get back to you if we don't have enough time for all of you on the dais.
To answer the actual question you asked very briefly, then,
which one's out there,
the policy.
Yeah.
So there's regulation, there's self-regulation. You know, we have the laws, norms, markets, architecture kind of framework. There's a lot of different levers in play. In the short term, I do believe it's the platforms, that their design decisions, their reweighting of algorithms that has the most immediate impact on striking the right balance between real speech and malicious automated speech. In the longer term, my preference is actually more for better communication in the way that you described, actually, between governments and, or between security apparatus and the platforms, rethinking the information operations doctrine, creating more of a deterrence framework that reduces the that increases the consequences for people who choose for foreign actors that behave in this way.
Okay, thank you. So you said he wanted just a real specific.
I just want to say
quick
very
response.
briefly about simultaneously timed floods of tweets that look like botnets. As many of us know, and certainly as you know, it's possible to arrange for that for those phenomena to arise with staggered tweets that are automated either through use of the tools on a platform or through use of an intermediary tool that does it for you. I just want to put that out there so that in some sense, it becomes a technical race. Do you want what is it that you want the platforms to do? Because the particular signature of botnet-like human activity is something that can be suppressed through various fairly straightforward measures.
I understand,
I
just
agree.
the idea of making this part of your design decision-making.
Yes.
Bake it in at the beginning, so it's in the DNA of the platform. That helps democracy. I totally.
You look at the dissemination patterns, you look at the actors, and the content actually should be last on the list of the things that you're looking at.
Okay, thank you. Berin, many have noticed that the Facebook hearings before the congressional committees last April were sort of a Sputnik moment for technology's impact on American democracy. It's easy to blame Congress for the sort of humiliating performance and Q&A that happened there. It might be the world's most powerful legislature, but it eliminated its technology staff in 1995. It's working at something like 40% less expert staff than it had in the 1970s, which was when those Schoolhouse Rock videos were made, to date that. As a pre-post-truth conservative and a lover of institutions, what policy framework do you advocate moving forward?
A what? A pre-post-truth?
You're pre-post-truth conservative.
Okay, first of all, I'm not a conservative.
Okay.
I think the pre-post-truth part is a compliment, so thank you.
It is.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, I am also a space lawyer. Space history is actually one of my particular interests. And I think the analogy to Sputnik's actually a great one because that was a great example of a hysterical panic over nothing, right? Sputnik was a fucking beeper. It didn't do anything, right? And the actual, if you want to read the great book on this, read The Heavens and the Earth, Walter McCormick's History of the Space Age, which basically showed that the United States actually had probably greater capability than the Russians, but basically Eisenhower wanted the Russians to go first to establish the principle of peaceful overflight in space. And he basically kept this a secret. He didn't want to reveal U.S. intelligence assets and essentially allowed the Democrats to win the 1960 presidential election because he valued his country more than his party. And he also hated Richard Nixon for, turns out, very good reasons. But anyway, but the point is that, so Sputnik sparked a huge reaction in the United States, but it was groundless. I mean, in the end, we beat the pants off the Soviets, and there was a good reason for that. It had been a long time coming. Similarly here, I think I don't want to diminish the threat to democracy and the potential for manipulation of public opinion. This is a very real problem. So do not mistake anything I say today for diminishing that. But at the same time, I think we are moving to this moment of uninformed panic, in part because people on the Hill really don't know what they're talking about. And everyone says that all the time. And they're generally very vague and condescending when they say it. I mean it very specifically. So just for example, you had in the round of discussions about this that started last fall, you had this unbelievable frenzy of concern about that $100,000 that was spent on by the Russians on advertising, and the solution therefore was to clamp down on advertising. Well, now Renee is much more of an expert on this than I am, but as I understand this, that $100,000 was essentially not spent on buying ads; it was spent on promoting accounts, and it was an important but a relatively small part of a viral marketing strategy. So the real effort to manipulate public opinion in the United States was not the thing that is fairly easily regulated in the traditional framework of regulation, which is this expenditure of funds on buying ads. It was this much more amorphous thing of creating fake accounts, getting to a situation where the fake account for the Tennessee Republican Party had more followers than the actual Twitter account for the Republican Party of Tennessee. It was that sort of thing. And so you combine that then with because Congress, as you say, in 1994 disestablished the Office of Technology Assessment, excuse me, the OTA. So they don't know what they're doing on the tech. They also don't understand the First Amendment at all. They don't care. They don't talk about it. When they do talk about it, they get it wrong. So this entire conversation about the Honest Ads Act and regulation of speech in Washington has proceeded from the false premise that this is just like broadcasting, right? Technologically, it's the same. It's the buying of ads, so we'll just regulate that. And if we can have these rules for broadcasting, why can't we have them for other media? Well, if you know anything about the First Amendment, you would know that broadcasters do not get full First Amendment protection because of the Supreme Court's 1969 decision in Red Lion, where the Supreme Court said, well, the government is issuing licenses to use the limited, scarce public waves. And for that reason, we're going to let the government regulate. Well, that's just not true for any other medium. And I can point you to the Supreme Court decisions that make this very clear. And it means that this entire conversation has been built on false premises about A, the technology, and B, what is constitutionally permissible. So it's a complete waste of time. We're not actually talking about the things I mentioned earlier, the things that the First Amendment generally gives you a roadmap to addressing, which is what's the government interest, how compelling is it, how do we deal with it through narrowly tailored mechanisms, which basically means starting from the ground up. What are the least restrictive means? If we had that conversation as a general matter, I think we'd get to a much more constructive place about regulation. We wouldn't waste our time on things that are going to be ineffective, or they're simply going to be struck down as unconstitutional, which most of these proposals, including those proposed by Senator Warner, would be.
Right, thank you, thank you. And my last question, before I'll have you ask each other questions if you'd like, is for Mike. And it's two parts. With considerable foresight, you predicted this current dilemma years ago. In 1990, could you explain Godwin's law for our viewing audience, which is my mom on a windmill modem in New Mexico somewhere. You predicted that we would descend into antagonistic polarization, and then all of a sudden Russia weaponized it. Did you see this coming? And then second, given the possible steps forward we just heard, could you troubleshoot? What do we risk in the future by adopting restrictions in law now? Are we overreacting with new legal remedies? Could you put forward an alternative?
Okay, well that's a lot, so I'll try to be brief so that everybody can quiz me on what I say. So Godwin's law is like it's like singing "My Way." If I were Frank Sinatra, singing "My Way," yeah, sing "My Way." No, Godwin's law is a thing that you can look up on the internet.
You're not going to sing it for us?
Godwin's law says, as an online discussion continues, the probability of a reference or comparison to Hitler or to Nazis approaches 1.
It's better when you sing it.
It is better when I sing it. Some aspects, certainly some aspects of the anxiety about social media are things that I predicted before there were social media platforms. We have always known this, and I've written about it again and again, and I guess I've made a career now out of writing about different aspects of it. But there are some things, I want to be clear, there are definitely some things that are new. Certainly the acceleration of dissemination of rumor is new, is a new thing. It's faster than it ever has been before. There are issues that people raise, and I want to just footnote this. There are people raise about computational propaganda and artificial intelligence, and there are different ways that issue is analyzed. But I'll note that there was a certain amount of anxiety about advertising, mass advertising, half a century ago, a little more than half a century ago. Vance Packard, wrote a book about it. It was a big deal, and the idea was that we were being manipulated, that we're losing human agency because we're exposed to advertising. And the whole, and what we learned is that Madison Avenue was hiring psychologists who put people, in labs and experimented on them to optimize how advertising works. And they did all this research, and they did it again and again. And then the theory was that advertising makes us all, lose our ability to make choices, or lose our ability to think reasonably about stuff. All sorts of mass media actually do affect our ability to think rationally. That's absolutely true, and I don't want to dispute that. But we also have responsibilities in democratic societies to train our brains to do better. I mean, and ideally, we educate ourselves to do that, or we educate one another to do that. And so every time I have, so to some extent, computational propaganda and AI strike me as the boogeyman du jour. I mean, it was advertising and psychological testing, and motivational research was the word that they used a lot back then. But to come back to your question, Renee.
It's what is your favorite? What is your favorite alternative? What would you do? Starting in the new session of Congress.
What would I do in the new session of Congress? Well, so I think I took a really good statistics course. And I would require every member of Congress.
Okay, so just so you know, there's a number of us who've worked on the Hill and who are going to present with a congressional perspective today, including Travis Moore and his wonderful program of putting technology fellows in personal offices on committee staff. So just, I mean, there's good news too.
Yeah, it is good news, and I'm not critical. And by the way, I think they're members of Congress. They're often. Most of the time, bright people. They can, they're not. There's nothing wrong with politicians. People who are good at being political, have learned how to be good politicians. That's not surprising. But they're not. There's nothing inherent about being a politician that makes you unable to figure out how to deal with things like technology. And we have outstanding politicians in office now who do think reasonably about technology. So I just want to give you that glimmer of hope. The other thing I would do is say, in terms, you asked what I would put in front as an alternative. I think we absolutely ought to have kind of a proactive, one of the things that we do in dealing with the rest of the world, as you know, is we have a Voice of America. And the purpose of Voice of America is not to be a propaganda voice for the USA. The purpose is to illustrate in ways around the world where otherwise there wouldn't be any proof of this, what journalism looks like, what media looks like. You prove it by positive examples. So what I really want to do is explore programs that show by positive example how we can respond as citizens and collectively to the changes that a new mass medium like social media platforms brings.
Okay, hey, Berin, so how about one quick follow-up, and then get your questions ready if anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask.
I think it's really easy to think that the problem is just that people on the Hill just don't know enough about how technology works. I don't think that's the primary problem. Fixing that would help. I think the primary problem is that their incentives are terrible. Their incentives are skewed towards, in a nutshell, demagoguery. And not to be confronted with the truth. So to just give you one quick example. So the conversation this afternoon about the allegation that conservatives have been making that social media are inherently biased against them revolves in significant part around this idea that, well, Marsha Blackburn was censored on YouTube. They're shutting down conservative speech. Well, what actually happened, partly what's going on here is that they don't understand the technology. Marsha Blackburn, when she launched her campaign for Senate, put an ad up on YouTube and then bought ads for it, for the video to promote it, saying that she had stopped Planned Parenthood from selling body parts. Well, that didn't happen because Planned Parenthood wasn't doing that, so she couldn't have stopped them. It's a lie. It's a fantasy. It's no different from the idea that Barack Obama is a secret Muslim and that Hillary Clinton was running a Satanist sex ring and so on. And so here's the critical problem, right? So it's not just that members of Congress don't understand why her content was acted against. They don't understand what happened. They don't understand that her account wasn't taken down. The content wasn't even taken down. She was simply barred from paying to promote that piece of content. And then here's the last critical piece. At the end of the day, when Twitter's CEO was brought up there about things like this, there's a different case because that was not Twitter, but about things like this, similar conspiracy theories, he didn't have the balls to say, we took action because this was either false or was involved in a misinformation campaign, because that would suggest that Republicans were full of shit, okay? Which is, in those particular cases, was the truth. And if you don't have people who are willing to tell members of Congress that and explain to them, no, it's not bias, you're actually, your accounts are being promoted by Russian actors, or you're lying. If you have a situation where you create that dynamic, what ends up happening is that the conspiracy theory just survives. And then they think, contrary to evidence about how technology actually works, that someone is out to get them, and they therefore, to the subject of this panel, are not willing to take seriously the efforts that these platforms are making to deal with real problems like misinformation or foreign propaganda. And that's how these two topics intersect. We can't fix that problem simply by reviving the Office of Technology Assessment or educating members of Congress.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. Renee, did you want to comment?
I disagree with all of that.
Yeah. Could you put the slide back on of the legislative status steps, if you have it available? So just really quickly, I would love this audience's help in the research I'm doing in congressional districts. We're doing something called building a Congress stack. What would a trust engine look like by repurposing already trusted public-serving information intermediaries? Things like public universities, libraries, museums, locally owned news organizations. And I tweeted a Medium piece that explains the whole research methods. And I would love any ideas, because this is really an idea of how do we build a new system by regenerating trust. So what I'd like to do now is ask again if the audience has any questions, or I'll have my panelists ask each other follow-up, or anything else that you would like to bring up that maybe we didn't.
So we have a question over here. Rules are one breath, and your question should end with a question mark.
Thank you, I couldn't see.
Okay, let me phrase it as a question.
Oh, sorry.
So how would you respond to this? This is for the gentleman on the end, Berin, right? In particular, because you just talked about blocking something on Twitter because it was false. And I think what you said made a lot of sense for one really key ingredient. So how would you deal with this? We know that Twitter is a private company, okay? But you say it's false. What makes you or Twitter or anybody else the judge of what's false? You say this is obviously false, but there were a lot of obviously false things through history that were true. And let me give you, I know people here probably love Edward Snowden. A lot of people would have blocked his information as false. How do we get information out there if it's okay to block something that you know is false?
Right. So I don't have to give you a normative answer to this question, because the First Amendment already answers this question. Twitter is a private company that has editorial discretion to decide what it wants to host and not host. Period. End of story. It's not a public forum, except insofar as maybe Donald Trump's Twitter account or the politicians' pages on Twitter. Those, perhaps, are considered public fora in the sense that government actors can't limit your ability to interact with those. The services overall are private. It's up to the platforms to decide what is true and false. Now, we can have a non-political, ethical conversation about how they should do so, what sources they should rely on. Is the Southern Poverty Law Center a reliable gauge of what constitutes a hate group? Those are all perfectly valid questions. We can talk about what degree of transparency, how they should explain themselves. But at the end of the day, the First Amendment in general is a really hard pill for anyone to swallow. It always has been, right? So when I sit here and I say that I think we are facing a very grave problem, that human nature is fundamentally flawed, that social media are making the problem worse, that is not inconsistent with my saying that there's really very little that the government can do to regulate the platforms about it, because they have First Amendment rights to deal with the problem. So it's not a satisfactory answer, but no conversation about the First Amendment ever is, really.
I'd add one thing to that really quickly, which is just we try really hard when we're looking at a particular campaign or evidence of manipulation to not address to not look at the content. So we look at the voices. Are the accounts authentic? You hear a lot about the disproportionate number of conservatives who lost followers in the bot rapture. That's because they had a disproportionate amount of bot followers. The bot rapture? Which is?
You have to explain that.
when Twitter just deactivated a whole pile of fake accounts. So the unfortunate... industry insider terms, when those accounts disappeared, were taken away, these sad reality, Barack Obama actually lost, I think, the largest number, just by virtue of the massive number of followers he had. There's a lot of complaining among the rank and file people who don't understand the algorithm, don't understand what's going on, that they were being censored, their followers were being taken away. No, bot accounts were being taken down. Similarly, so when you have the voices, then you have the dissemination patterns. A lot of what we look at is there evidence that this video is being artificially amplified in some way? The person who put up the video may not have intended for that to happen, but that's the entire problem, and that's where the tech platforms have to do a better job, because as long as a Russian botnet can pick up Ted Cruz's stupid click button message and amplify it 10,000 times more, that at that point is on Twitter, because what it does is it actually does silence the voices of the real people who were going through that clicktivism campaign, because the artificial amplification comes in and shuts it down. Artificially amplifies it, and then the platform clamps down on it as a spam. So the irony here is that in some ways the freedom of kind of algorithmic freedom of speech in many ways is silencing the very real voices that actually have something to say.
So let me just add something, because I think I can tie something that Renee said and something that Berin said together, and that's that we recognize under the First Amendment that we can have time, place, and manner restrictions. They're content neutral. So if you want to sort of think about this in terms of First Amendment talk, it certainly seems possible that the platforms could decide on their own, and ideally they would do that rather than be compelled to do it by a government that may not know every single thing that they need to know in terms of designing the algorithms. But certainly the platforms could impose restrictions. Certainly platforms could impose the restrictions on how the platform is used that are content neutral, and I'm not opposed to that.
I think let me real fast. There's just one
let me
person
just
who's
note
been
here
waiting
one
over
quick
here.
point. So setting aside everything I've just said about the First Amendment, doesn't apply in the European Union, and the General Data Protection Regulation, the new European Privacy Regulation, has a requirement that algorithmic decisions be explainable. It is yet to be seen what that means in this context, but I don't see it why it wouldn't apply. So there is going to be perhaps a legal mechanism outside the United States that requires some degree of explainability for why these decisions are being made, and we'll see how the platforms respond.
Thank you for that. Yeah, ma'am, you get to clean up. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Marianne, and there is something that's missing, especially with younger people. Where are the parents' teaching responsibilities? With the TV, when I was growing up, my mother just said, there are programs you're not going to watch. That's number one. And number two, I see a lot of reactive behavior. The technology come, and how are we going to deal with it? How about being a little more proactive, and maybe we shouldn't go down the same path? The Indians said some stones should be left in the ground, and some stones should be turned. What are we going to do with? And the other thing is, I think we should start teaching. Shouldn't we start teaching what propaganda is? When I was growing up, in history, we took a speech apart by Adolf Hitler. We should be teaching, maybe we should read the mass psychology of fascism. Why aren't we being more proactive and starting to give the young people the tools so they can make decisions what speech is? And one more thing, there are a lot of things I could be doing. The Daily Stormer has a right to be there, but I don't have to watch it, and I won't.
Thank you. Those are good words to wrap up here. I don't know if anybody has a quick comment. I have a 12-year-old who's addicted to Fortnite, and yesterday I called the internet company and shut it down completely in my house. So I'm struggling with this every day.
I think one of the things there are definitely. I have 2 little kids, and we're very careful. They can't read yet, so we're not quite at that point. But I think one of the challenges has actually been explaining to older people who didn't grow up with the algorithms how they work, what they do. I spent a lot of time engaging with people on Twitter after the bot rapture, talking to people who had lost a lot of followers and listening to what they had to say. And they were saying things like, well, I know I'm being censored because people don't see all of my tweets. And in an algorithmic feed, that's actually normal. That is what is supposed to happen, unfortunately. There is curation at work. I think that people don't understand the extent to which the internet is curated, because one of the main differences in sort of the earlier eras versus now is the problem of information glut. There is so much content. And that's why so much of it, when we talk about the platforms decide what you see, that's because in some ways there's no way for that not to happen, because the curation is such a key component to the experience on the internet. And I have noticed that people who are more accustomed to more traditional broadcast or believe that when they say something on Facebook, everyone who follows them on Facebook sees it, I don't think the platforms have necessarily done the best job at explaining what they do, and not the specifics of how it works, not the trade secrets, but just the fact that content on the internet is curated, and that is not censorship.
So two quick points, right? So get back to the First Amendment. Every First Amendment approach to any issue begins with less restrictive means, and at the top of that list is always education and things like parental empowerment. If we spent half as much time in Congress talking about funding civics education in this country, instead of fantasies about how to regulate social media platforms that make headlines, we would be in a much better position. That's point number one. Point number two, to your point about there are some stones that shouldn't be turned. Look, unfortunately, this is the technological determinist in me tells me that every stone that can be turned will be turned. And we have to deal with that reality. There is no way to stop that from the top down. The best we can do is try to build an informed citizenry and not discourage the gatekeepers that we have today, which is, frankly, the platforms do play that role, from exercising some discretion. And unfortunately, there are people, for political reasons, who are trying to undermine the platform's ability to do so by setting up the government as a second guesser of the decisions they make.
So I have one more thought, just very briefly. The risk right now is that we will, and keep in mind that the law, Section 230, that protects platforms was designed to enable the platforms to curate, because everybody understood that platforms wanted to be able, that we needed platforms. We needed media, we needed the World Wide Web and the internet to be able to have people make decisions about what to show us, so that we weren't necessarily swamped with a glut of information. And the second thing you have to recognize is that when you require platforms to do this, because human beings ultimately are at the top of the decision chain about how to curate in response to pressure from Congress, you see it, and when Congress and the rest of us are unhappy with the result, then we'll ask them to regulate more. So it turns into a cycle where we keep pushing the platforms to do more and more, and we're unhappy because the wrong people are silenced, or for other reasons, because it's ultimately human fallibility informs the censorship decisions.
Thank you, panelists, and catch up with us in the break if you have follow-up questions. Thanks.
Please join me in thanking the panel for a great conversation.